All right, last lecture on the African American Civil Rights Movement. Movement changes. We'll go into some stuff that go up into the current day as well. So, setting the stage, despite significant gains being made, many people were growing impatient with the movement. They wanted more significant victories. They wanted them quicker. And another big part is that people are going to begin to question Martin Luther King Jr. as the leader of the Civil Rights Movement. They question his politics, and we'll talk about that because he gets pretty radical in his life, his leadership, and his methods. They ask, is nonviolence the answer? For how long can we take getting beaten in the streets for just marching and asking for the right to vote? And other things, right? How many people can we have get killed or get hurt or get maimed or get arrested for just asking for equality? So you're going to see some more militant responses out of some people. So there's King right there. When he dies, he will not be particularly popular. A lot of that will have to do with his radical politics, the fact that he's seen as the older, or part of the older side of the civil rights movement, so young civil rights leaders maybe don't look up to him quite as much as they look up to other leaders. But there will be a lot of questions about his leadership. So, review question. What did Brown versus the Board of Education do? Did it A, end public school segregation with all deliberate speed? Did it B, say that separate but equal was constitutional? Did it C, outlaw integration? Or did it D, end segregation at lunch counters? All right, so as the movement changes, there will be a lot of violence. Okay, there'll be riots. Many riots. Okay, there'll be some before King gets killed. When King gets assassinated, there'll be more riots. So, the first big one we're going to talk about are the Watts riots. 6 days of rioting in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles. This will start when a white police officer arrested a black driver for drunk driving. The driver was definitely drunk, but the people of Watts believe that they had been mistreated by the police for years, including some violence in this incident. So, they will crowd around the police officers, watch this arrest, and throw rocks and start to become a little violent. This all follows years and years and years and years of protest over police brutality and segregation in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles. The LAPD had been investigated multiple times, had been protested against multiple times for racism within the department and how they treated the people that they were supposed to serve as police officers. The situation will quickly escalate into a riot, a huge riot. In the end, 34 people will die, 2,000 will be injured, and 4,000 will get arrested. Riots were viewed as a reaction to racial tension. Martin Luther King Jr. himself will say that riots are the language of the unheard. If you don't listen to their problems, if you don't try to help them with their problems, then eventually people are going to get mad enough to riot. And this is an example of that. Is this similar today? Now, some of these references are a little dated. There was rioting in Baltimore recently after the controversial police killing of a woman by the name of Sandra Bland. In Ferguson, after other officer-involved violence. In fact, it turned out in Ferguson that the police department was basically funding itself by giving tickets, mostly to minority people. The shooting there, the hands up, don't shoot thing, turned out possibly to be more, turned out to be more legitimate than the protesters wanted it to, but the underlying conditions were pretty negative against the Ferguson Police Department. So we still have issues with this all the way to now, to our lifetime. So some of the Watts rioting, you see they brought the police in there. There will be more rioting in Los Angeles in 1992, and after the Rodney King trial, I think we'll talk about that as well. If not in this lecture, then obviously we'll talk about it when we get to the 90s. So, true or false, the Watts rioting and violence came out of nowhere. All right, another part of the movement that doesn't get talked about a ton is when Martin Luther King goes north. On January 7th of 1966, Martin Luther King and his group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, announced plans for the Chicago Freedom Movement, a campaign that marked the expansion of their civil rights activities from the South to northern cities. So basically, they're going to go to the north to talk about segregation there, talk about how bad the conditions were in black areas and majority-minority areas, to try to get some more integration, try to get some more equality in the city of Chicago. Throughout that summer, King is going to face organizational challenges of mobilizing Chicago's diverse African-American community, cautioning against further violence, and working to counter the mounting resistance of working-class whites who feared that the impact of open housing on their neighborhoods. King observed that many whites who oppose open housing would deny that they are racist. They turn to sociological arguments without realizing that criminal responses are environmental, not racial. So what King is saying there is that black people don't commit crimes because something in their racial DNA tells them to commit crimes. They commit crimes in response to how their environmental conditions are. If they're in neighborhoods that don't have economic opportunities, they don't have stable housing, they don't have good schools, then yeah, people are going to turn to bad things. Anybody would. And subsequently, research has proven out that point, that basically all races commit crime at the same rate, and that in areas of low economic opportunity, there is more crime, despite what race you may be. So, after negotiating with Mayor Daley and various housing boards, a summit agreement was announced in which the Chicago Housing Authority promised to build public housing with limited height requirements, and the Mortgage Bankers Association agreed to make mortgages available regardless of race. Although King called the agreement the most significant program ever conceived to make open housing a reality, he recognized that it was only the first step in a 1,000-mile journey. So, he will say about the North, and I quote, "I have never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hateful as I've seen here in Chicago." There's a great movie about this called King in the Wilderness. It's from HBO. I don't know how you can access it without an HBO subscription, but maybe try. The internet's a big place. All right, the next big riot, the 1967 Detroit riot. This will begin in the early morning hours of Sunday, July 23rd of 1967. The event that sparked this was the police raid of an unlicensed after-hours bar known as a Blind Pig on the city's near west side. So, blind pigs were people that would basically have bars in their houses or behind their houses or whatever. A lot of people in majority black neighborhoods ran blind pigs because they could not get business licenses or loans to start a legitimate bar. So, this raid was the event that set off everything. As we'll see with other riots, there were a lot of underlying conditions, but that this will be a spark. Housing, educational, and job segregation, discrimination were the underlying issues. Right? I have family members from Detroit who were bussed into majority black neighborhoods who had bad experiences. There were black kids that were bussed into majority white neighborhoods that had bad experiences. Again, this is another example of a huge issue stemming from the idea that we didn't want to make life uncomfortable for rich people, right? These were in neighborhoods where people were already competing for jobs. There was not economic security. So if my dad hates your dad because you guys are fighting for the same job, then it's probably going to turn out that I don't like you because our dads don't like each other, right? A lot of that, but on a much bigger scale. And that helps explain what's going on in Detroit, right? The people on the ground aren't the people I would blame. I wouldn't blame the family members of mine who have bad experiences there, who still have scars from that. I don't blame them for that because they were put in an awful position. And I don't particularly blame the people who were unhappy, the minority people in Detroit who were super unhappy with their unequal treatment. They were put in a horrible position. So when you put everybody in this untenable position, really bad stuff happens. And that's when the riot happens. So to help end the disturbance, Governor George Romney orders the Michigan National Guard into Detroit. President Lyndon Johnson sends the United States Army 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions in. After the rioting is done, the result will be 43 people dead, 1,189 injured, 7,200 arrests, and more than 2,000 buildings destroyed. Dumb things were done by both the police and the rioters. There will be widespread looting, but there was also targeting of specific people and buildings by the police. There was targeting of specific buildings by the rioters. They didn't burn down black-owned businesses, they burned down other ones. But an example of the police targeting on the other side, there was a bookstore called Vaughn's Bookstore, was targeted and destroyed because it was a gathering place for civil rights groups. The police shot 1,800 bullets into it and then turned on the water taps to flood the store. A group called Stress, which was called Stop the Robberies, Enjoy Safe Streets, was created to help, I guess, police communities after this. It will ignore white criminal behavior, focus strictly on black communities, conducted raids without warrants, was confrontational and violent, and will kill 20 people in its first 30 months before it has to be disbanded. So there'll be idiocy on both sides, there'll be violence on both sides, and all this stems from the fact that we refused to try to integrate in a humane way. We just threw people together and said, figure it out. And when we do that, things don't work out super well. So, pictures of the rioting. More pictures of it. People getting arrested. Fires all over the place. And here's the last big picture we'll have of it. Rosa Parks, we talked about, had actually moved to Detroit at this point, and her house was right in the middle of all the rioting, but it was not destroyed. All right, Malcolm X and the movement in the North. Malcolm X, a very controversial figure who will be very, very militant, very, very loud throughout his life, but he will actually moderate a lot towards the end. Anyways, a movement was growing in the North calling for segregation as equals. Okay, and Malcolm X will be one of the leaders of that movement. Okay, instead of just saying we want equality, they said we want to be away from white people and be equal to white people. We want our area, we want our sort of freedom, we want to be away. All right, so they want to segregate still. Some of them did, at least Malcolm X did for the beginning of his life. So, some famous quotes from from Malcolm X that will make people scared of him. So he'll say, "Cast off the shackles by any means necessary," meaning that violence was an option for this part of the movement. He says you don't have a non-violent revolution, which again denotes that there will be violence. One of his quotes that I think is pretty spot on when it comes to talking about how civil rights legislation and how we think about civil rights in this country works. He says, "If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and you pull it out 6 inches, there is no progress. If you pull it out all the way, that's not progress. Progress is healing the wound that the blow made. And they haven't even pulled out the knife, much less healed the wound." So he's saying is, the wound he's talking about is things like slavery and 100 years of segregation. And he says if you just make that less bad, right, you end slavery, you keep segregation, that's not fixing things. That's just making things a little bit less bad. It's not fixed until you end segregation, until you make us whole for the issues that we had to face, for all the for things like we talked about, how they couldn't buy houses, how they couldn't get loans and stuff like that, how they were redlined into communities full of poverty and low economic opportunities. So until you fix those things, this isn't progress. This is you just trying to make things look like there's progress. So this emerges in the late 1960s, this more militant, more violent, possibly part of the movement, emerges because they don't feel like they're getting enough victories out of Martin Luther King's movement of nonviolence. So it's different from the South, right? The South, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee would work with the white majority, try to use moral suasion is what they call it, to convince white people to act better, I suppose. In the North, Malcolm X, okay, his movement, right, the Black Power movement, will say we don't want any help from white people. They haven't helped us. We want to do it on our own. We want segregation as equals. The Southern movement will be more organized than the North. Right? That's something that's important to remember, right? The South had much stronger organizational leadership in the South than the North did. Right? I want to make sure I said that right. The South had better organizational leadership than the North. So Malcolm X will be the spokesperson for a new group called the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam was a black Muslim group that promoted segregation as equals, that promoted black power, that promoted not having white and black people really together, right? They wanted to do everything on their own. They rejected integration, believed that black supremacy was the answer to white supremacy. Malcolm X himself was a devout Muslim, will eventually travel to Mecca, right, which is one of the 2 or 3 most important sites in the Muslim faith. Every Muslim once in their life is supposed to go to Mecca. They call it the pilgrimage or the Hajj. So he will go there, and when he goes there, he has some pretty profound experiences. So he will leave the Nation of Islam. He will stop believing as much about segregation as equals, but more about forming an equality, an equitable society in America. So his tone will change a little bit. He's still much more in your face, much more militant than Martin Luther King, but he was less militant than as he started. However, we don't really get to see all of his evolution because he gets assassinated in 1965 while giving a speech in New York. So that'll be the end of Malcolm X. There's a movie about Malcolm X starring Denzel Washington. I believe it's called either X or Malcolm. It's on Netflix if you want to watch it. I've heard it's good. I've never watched it myself. So he published a newspaper called Muhammad Speaks. So basically it's the paper for the Nation of Islam, right? Muhammad being the primary prophet in that religion. So it says right there, freedom can't wait. He would give speeches. He would do all sorts of debates with people, very much in your face, which wasn't something that we had had a lot of in American history. You'd have to go back all the way to Marcus Garvey in the 1920s for someone to be as in your face as Malcolm X was. So, who was the civil rights leader in the North who saw the civil rights movement as a radical chance to empower the black community through segregation as equals? Was it A, Malcolm X, B, Martin Luther King Jr., C, Stokely Carmichael, or D, Ralph Abernathy? All right, so why is Martin Luther King Jr. more beloved than Malcolm X? And are these people opposites of each other? No, that's not really true, right? They got along pretty well. They didn't meet a ton. They didn't coordinate a whole lot of stuff a ton, but they both were going towards the same goal. So the truth here is that neither of these two men were popular in white America during their lifetimes. Okay, by the time King dies, his approval rating is like 36%. When Malcolm X is assassinated, his approval rating nationwide is like 10%, right? They were not popular figures. King will not be beloved by majority of Americans, by mainstream America, until decades after his death. Malcolm X still not exactly beloved. So, they didn't hate each other. They ultimately wanted black Americans to have better lives, but they understood that they had different ideas of how to get there. King and the movement he embodied penetrated the conscience of whites. Okay, that was his goal, was to use moral arguments to convince people to act better towards each other. King was not only unearthed emotion and guilt, but he also provided an answer or a way out by promising that nonviolent civil disobedience will not only win black freedom, but also purify, cleanse, and heal the sickness within white society. So he's, again, being very moral, saying, hey, this is a problem, but we can fix it. Here's how you fix it. Right? He provided a chance for white society to fix their racial sins. Malcolm X, on the other hand, was unapologetically black, Muslim, and loud, all things that very much scared 1960s white America. And he did not care about white salvation. He didn't care if white people felt guilty or if they didn't. He didn't care about fixing them or anything like that. He cared about his people, and he cared about improving the lives of black Americans. So, different ideas, different tactics, but they were going towards the same goal. And so here's a picture of them meeting. They did not hate each other. There will be some friction between the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Nation of Islam later on, but not between these two gentlemen. All right, the March Against Fear. James Meredith, who we talked about in the last lecture, who helped integrate Ole Miss, he, like I said, becomes a civil rights leader for the rest of his life, and he decides to organize what they call the March Against Fear. Okay? And he will get shot while marching against fear. Meredith had, like I said, integrated Ole Miss. He plans a 220-mile march from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi to protest violence in the area and to encourage black people to vote. After Meredith gets shot, King was not a part of this. Meredith organized it all on his own. But when he gets shot, King flies down to help finish the march. This will again help fuel the violent side of the changing movement, the more militant side, right? This will encourage people like Stokely Carmichael, who has become the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, to embrace black power and to embrace at least black defense. Maybe not black militancy, but at least black physical defense when they get shot at to shoot back. So, the March Against Fear on the left, you can see King in there in one of the straw hats. On the right, you can see him as well. So on the bottom right, that is King with Stokely Carmichael, who I just talked about, will take a turn towards the Black Power movement after this, after he sees more people getting shot. And in the middle, you see Meredith getting shot. He obviously will survive. Like I said, he was just wounded, but he does get shot marching against fear. We can't march against fear, then what can we march against? That's where the Black Power movement starts kind of getting more and more traction. So, the March Against Fear was meant to protest blank and encourage blank. There are two correct answers here. Was it meant to protest and encourage A, violence, B, segregation, C, voting, D, busing? Obviously, two of those are right. All right, so leading into the Black Power movement, Stokely Carmichael, the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, started preaching black power due to his anger, frustration, and impatience at the pace of equality. So, black power will be most profoundly shown through the Black Panther Party and through the Malcolm X sort of more militant northern leadership in this part of the civil rights movement, right? So it was the idea that blacks had the power to resist, and not just nonviolently, right? But to assert their own equality, to assert their own place in society, and to do so violently if necessary, to protect themselves, right? And not just take the beatings, or take the police dogs, or take the lynchings, or whatever, and try to act morally better, but to fight fire with fire. That's kind of where black power comes from. So, in 1966, a militant group called the Black Panthers was organized. It was founded by a guy by the name of Huey Newton to patrol black neighborhoods and to protect residents from police brutality. So that's the first goal of the Black Panthers, was to protect black people from the police, because they thought that they were being persecuted based on their race. We saw this with the Watts riot, we'll see this in the Detroit riot, we'll see this in other places. Eventually evolved into a political movement and a party. Super, super insanely ultra controversial then, and still very controversial now. They did some intense and awesome community projects, like helping needy families in their community. They had a food program for kids, they had after-school tutoring, they had free childcare for working mothers and fathers. They had all sorts of programs that were awesome and helpful, and then they also had some bad things, some very bad things, including violence, right? Violence between members and the police, members and the FBI. To the FBI's part, they will fear that the civil rights movement itself is extremely dangerous to the country and is part of the Cold War and all this stuff, so they're going to monitor and infiltrate different groups in the civil rights movement, including infiltrating the Black Panther Party. So, at one point, it's estimated that about 10% of all the Black Panthers were actually FBI informants, and this is going to lead to shootouts in Chicago and Los Angeles, the most infamous of which being the killing of Fred Hampton in Chicago. Fred Hampton was a young activist for the Black Panther Party, was very charismatic, described himself as a socialist and all these things. He organized a whole bunch of groups in Chicago at a very young age, and the FBI decided that he was someone they had to get rid of in very stark terms. So they will have some people on the inside that will drug him, and while he's asleep next to his pregnant wife, they will kick down the doors of what they call the Panther Pad, which is where the Black Panthers in each community hung out. They had a group home, and they will shoot him many, many, many times. Thousands of rounds of bullets will be shot in, very few will be shot out. Eventually, the FBI won't really admit guilt, but the city of Chicago will have to pay millions of dollars to Fred Hampton's widow and family as restitution for what they will now consider the unlawful killing of Fred Hampton. Huey Newton will go to jail. Many of the members of the party will go to jail. Leadership will go to jail, and eventually the party will split up in the 1980s. So there's Fred Hampton. In the middle there on the left is Huey Newton. On the far right are some Panthers marching around. They marched around in military-style garb with berets, often openly carrying weapons, which was very scary to many Americans at that point. Side note, as we talk about guns and stuff like that, the Black Panthers marched with automatic rifles into the California state legislation, or into their chambers, to legislative chambers, one time protesting some gun control measures. So they're kind of all over the place. I mean, not all over the place, but they're pretty varying positions that they took politically during the Reagan years. Anyways, Fred Hampton's murder, eventually $1.8 million in the 1980s was given to Hampton's widow and child and family as restitution for this killing. So obviously they're admitting some guilt there if they're going to pay them almost $2 million. So here's what the Black Panthers put out. This was their 10-point program. Some of this is controversial. Some of this doesn't seem all that bad to me. So they want freedom. They want the power to determine the destiny of their community. They want full employment. Everybody wants full employment. They want to end the robbery by the capitalists of our black community. So they're saying that black people are working and not getting their share, right, is what they're saying with that one. They want a decent housing fit for shelter of human beings. So they're saying that the public housing that they were living in, the slums they were living in, weren't good enough. They want education for their people that exposes the true nature of this decadent American society. We want education that teaches us our true history and our role in this present-day society. I would agree with that point. We don't talk about the bad stuff in U.S. history very much. I try to be better about that. None of us need to be cheerleaders through everything all the time, and so I would agree we need to tell the whole history of our country. So that all black men need to be exempt from military service. Of course, that is a controversial one when we have drafts and stuff like that. This becomes a much bigger issue, though, in the 70s, when it is proven that the draft for Vietnam was disproportionately drafting minority people and poor white people. So eventually the draft gets abolished after that. So maybe they were ahead of their time a bit. We wanted the immediate end to police brutality and the murder of black people. So when I just talked about Ferguson, or I talked about the Black Lives Matter movement a little bit, this isn't anything that came out of nowhere, right? There's been accusations, there's been maybe some documentation, there's been fights over police brutality in minority communities for a very long time. This is from the 60s, right? So that's 60 years from right now. They want freedom for all our black men held in federal, state, county, and city prisons and jails. They want everyone released from prison. There is a prison abolition movement. I don't know if I would agree with all that, but that's what they wanted. They want all black people, when brought to trial, to be tried in a court by a jury of their peer group or people from their black communities as defined by the Constitution of the United States. There were still issues with representation in juries. There's eventually a big Supreme Court case called the Batson case, the Batson decision, the Batson threshold. So there was some proof that in some communities they were purposely kicking black people off of juries and creating all-white jury panels. So eventually the Supreme Court had to step in and try to fix that. And they want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. We all want that. So that one's not super controversial. So some of the things they staked out were pretty controversial. Some weren't. But all of this is me talking about it from 2020, right? Some of the stuff was way, way, way more controversial 60 years ago than it would be right now. So the Panthers, very controversial. I would recommend you do more research into it yourself from a variety of places, and then you can kind of make up your mind about what you think about the Black Panther Party. So, members of the party, different pictures, talking about the things that they want, okay, and what they need and all that sort of stuff. There are still Black Panthers in jail for shooting police officers. Obviously, no one supports that. No one should support that. So lots to do with the Black Panthers, more than I can talk about to you in just one lecture. So, the Black Panthers were a blank group that evolved into a blank group. Militant, peaceful, anarchist, or political. Obviously, there's two answers here, A, B, C, or D. All right. So, COINTELPRO and the FBI's war on the civil rights movement. We may or may not do an activity on this. We'll see. I know everything's kind of up in the air. So, the FBI was openly hostile towards the civil rights movement. They did not want the civil rights movement to continue. They saw it as an attack on traditional American values in some ways, and also possibly an attempt to create a more communist society. Because at this point, a lot of people didn't believe really in equality based on race, and thought that that was a dangerous and communist idea. So, Martin Luther King Jr., his house, his hotel rooms, they were bugged. They were monitored. The FBI was listening in on them. They did this illegally. They didn't have warrants for wiretapping him or for other leaders like Malcolm X or people within the Black Panther Party, but they will do it anyways. Martin Luther King will be labeled the most dangerous Negro in America. FBI will try to silence him. They'll try to blackmail him and intimidate him into being quiet. And how did they do this? Well, just like anybody else, Martin Luther King was not a perfect person. Martin Luther King did cheat on his wife. They recorded him cheating on his wife, and they sent his wife the audio of Martin Luther King cheating on her to try to intimidate him into being quiet, that they'll ruin his life or whatever. She stood by him, and they get to make their decisions in their relationship. But that will anger the FBI that they continue on with the movement. So the leader of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, will send anonymous letters that have later been proven to be written by him telling Dr. King to kill himself. Repeatedly, he did this. And the FBI building is still named after him. The FBI will infiltrate the Black Panthers. By some estimates, like I said, up to 10% of all party members were informants of the FBI. So they used this COINTEL counterintelligence program to infiltrate the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the women's liberation movement, the Latino rights movement, the American Indian movement, to try to put an end to some of these civil rights movements because they saw them as dangerous. So, COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program, was created to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, neutralize, or otherwise eliminate social movements, including the anti-war movement and all the different civil rights movements. They had 4 steps to do this. Number 1, they would infiltrate. Number 2, they would use psychological warfare to try to turn people in the movement against each other. Number 3, they would harass them by the legal system, charge them with all sorts of crimes. And then number 4, if they had to, they would use illegal force. which means killing people, which means things like what happened to Fred Hampton in Chicago. COINTELPRO was exposed in 1971 after an FBI office was broken into. Its files were stolen and given to news agencies for publication. So the FBI is doing all sorts of bad stuff. The government looks into that through what we call the Church Committee, named after a senator from Idaho. They investigated the COINTEL program and found that it was unconstitutional, that it created techniques used or that would be intolerable in a democratic society, and that the Bureau conducted a sophisticated vigilante operation aimed squarely at preventing the exercise of the First Amendment rights of speech and association on the theory that preventing the growth of dangerous groups and the propagation of dangerous ideas would protect the national security and deter violence. So, the FBI illegally using its powers to disrupt the civil rights movement. The Church Committee tried to rein that in. There's J. Edgar Hoover there on the left, who'll be the leader of the FBI for a very, very long time. Not particularly the greatest of people. He'll blackmail presidents. He'll have secret files of secret information that he got through non-legal means of surveillance on all sorts of different people. On the right, a headline talking about the COINTEL program getting exposed. All right, the FBI, the counterintelligence program created to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, neutralize, or otherwise eliminate social movements was called what? Was it A, COINTELPRO? Was it B, EDM-DNE? Was it C, the Manhattan Project, or D, the Hoover program? Important, also know here, the FBI is not all bad. I don't particularly love the FBI. They've done a lot of dumb things in our history, same with the CIA. But they could, at times, do good things too. The FBI, very famously, has done a very good job of destroying the KKK by infiltrating the Klan. So there's good and there's bad. But this is an example of them doing a lot of bad to civil rights movements. With that, I'm going to stop right here because I'm going to run out of time, and I'm going to pick it up, so this will be another two-part lecture.